I hear people say, I was just mad, I had to do it. Or I was sad and so I had to do it. Whatever the emotion is, I want to tell you today, you do not have to be a slave to your emotion. There is a higher authority than your emotion. Let me show you what that is today. In Ezekiel chapter 24, an amazing thing happens. God says to Ezekiel, your wife is going to die. Let me read you what it says here. He says in verse 15, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, behold, I'm going to take the delight of your eyes away from you in a stroke. Now, I don't know if she had a stroke or what, but just like that, he says, I'm taking her away. Yet you shall not mourn or weep or tears run down. He says, I'm not going to let you weep. Sigh, but not aloud. Make no mourning for the dead. The Bible says in verse 18, at evening my wife died, and on the next morning I did as I was commanded. Verse 19, the people say, wait a minute. Your wife died, you're not crying. What does this mean? They've seen him long enough to know that everything's a symbol in his life. So, a few things about this. 4 things, really. Number 1, sudden death happens, even to prophets. You and I are not immune to tragic situations happening in our lives. So don't think because you follow the Lord that you're going to have this life without problems. I mean, if anyone would, it would have been Ezekiel, and he didn't. Or the disciples, and most of them died for their faith. So sudden tragedy happens. Number 2, God does not make sense all the time. You'll go to your grave, and there'll be some questions you'll still have like, God, why did you allow this? Why did this happen? I don't understand it. I don't think anybody's gone to their grave without those questions. There's only one time in the Bible that we have a death, and God says, don't mourn the death. And it doesn't make a lot of sense in some ways. I mean, there's a way that it does make sense, which I'll show you in a second. But to Ezekiel, he's like, couldn't you have done this a different way? Maybe. Number 3, mourning is natural. If you've lost a loved one, the most natural, normal thing and healthy thing is to mourn the loss. It's so natural. God had to tell him, you can't do it here. Only time we see that in Scripture. Number 4, if we are going to obey God, we have to, at times, set aside our emotions. They have to take a back seat to obedience. Because if you are a slave to your emotions, whether it's anger or sadness or grief or irritation or even happiness, you will not be able to obey God. And in this case, Ezekiel had to set aside everything inside of him that said, man, I want to mourn for her. She's dead. She was the delight of my eyes. And he was able to do it. And God will give you the power to do the same thing. Not that he's going to ask you not to mourn the death of a loved one. I'm not saying that. But there's times when emotion can overtake a situation. And you're not going to be able to react well if the emotion is driving everything. Now, why did this happen? Well, frankly, so that people would say, what's going on? And he was able to say in verse 19, look, just as my wife was my joy and my security, Israel, your sanctuary is your joy and your security, and God's going to take that away immediately, quickly. And they said, oh, so you just wanted to get our attention so we could hear this message? Thanks, but we don't believe you. And then judgment occurred. But God used this man's life and every part of his life. Just know that God has a plan for our lives. God didn't leave Ezekiel alone. God was with him. I don't know what happened after this, if there was another prophet wife that came along, but God used even this prophet's wife in a way that he wouldn't have chosen to be used, but he chose to do that. God chose to do that. For you and I today, there's going to come a point in this day that you're going to have this temptation to let your emotion drive the bus. Don't. Let your obedience to God drive the bus today.